Welcome everybody. This is the second day of our Afghanistan session at the Manohar Parrikar Institute of Defense Studies and Analysis. And today we are going to be focusing on regional perspectives. So our first speaker is Professor Pervez Hoodbhoy, who is actually started off his career in engineering, mathematics, and is a renowned physicist and has taught for many years. But in recent years, he has also emerged as a leading commentator and a leading columnist on not just nuclear security related issues, but also wider political regional security issues and other social concerns that affect the entire region, Pakistan certainly. Welcome, Pervez. It's great to see you. And let me then invite you to talk about how Pakistan sees, the Taliban victory, because frankly, there is no other word for it. Taliban have achieved a military victory, and I think that perhaps animates part of their decision for their lack of interest in power sharing, as it were. They just feel, why the hell should we share power with somebody who has been militarily defeated? Because they've not come on the basis of a negotiated settlement into Kabul. They have come into Kabul as a military victor. So, and then we've seen some recent moves where the Haqqani network, Sirajuddin Haqqani apparently acted as a kind of a via media to broker a ceasefire with the TTP and the Pakistan government. And I understand that that ceasefire has now collapsed. So what does the situation look like? How does Pakistan assess where it is now? And is there a feeling of regret? Is there a feeling still of, when on 15th of August, when the Taliban entered Kabul, there was a kind of an exultation or a euphoria that was there. Has that been tempered with some realism, or how does it look? So you've got 15 minutes, and over to you.
Thank you, Rakesh. It's great to see you again. Thank you, Dr. Chinoy, for inviting me, and Dr. Ashok, and I look forward to a good discussion. Unfortunately, I have to take a flight to Karachi very soon, so you will excuse my not being present after after the Q&A, after my presentation. So yes, Rakesh, that triumphalism is there. It was there on the 15th of August. It's still here. After all, our boys have won in Afghanistan, and it was not a negotiated settlement. It was an out-and-out victory. At the same time, there is a recognition that there have been certain costs incurred in the victory. At one level, they have been geopolitical. So there has been a definite souring of ties with the United States. The jubilation initially didn't go well with Washington. Imran Khan coming out and saying that the Taliban have broken the chains of slavery, and with commentators here on television thumping their chests, that was not lost, and it rubbed salt into the wounds of the Americans. After all, they'd been there 20 years, put in God knows what, $1 trillion into Afghanistan. And so there is predictably annoyance. Biden has yet to call Imran Khan, and that is a cause of some heartburning here. In fact, Imran Khan had pointedly referred to the fact that Biden's been calling everyone, but has not called him. In response to that, expectedly, I'd say, Pakistan has set about further strengthening its ties with China. It did not participate in the US Democracy Summit. And China, of course, did not do so because of Taiwan and the situation in the of the islands. Now, the hope in Pakistan is that China will stabilize Afghanistan. Presently, it is highly unstable, as we know, and that China will make use of the mining of the mineral wealth of Afghanistan and will therefore be able to create institutions inside Afghanistan and stabilize the country. The present state of desperate poverty will soon be a matter of the past. Now, so far, that doesn't seem to be happening. The Chinese seem to be very are not willing to empty their pockets over there, or in fact give anything substantial. And the investment in mining seems to be deterred by the fact that this instability is not likely to be over very soon because of the challenges that the Taliban are facing internally, in particular from Daesh, ISIS. Now, these fears, the fears of the Chinese, are not unfounded, given how Chinese assistance is working out in Pakistan, and in particular in Balochistan. As you might have heard, there have been massive demonstrations with a good fraction of the entire population of Gwadar coming out and protesting that they're being deprived of their livelihoods because of foreign fishing off the coast, because of lack of electricity and water. And this is the flagship project of the Pakistan government. This is the flagship project of CPEC, the Chinese-Pakistani Economic Corridor. And so at a time when there is such instability, when the flagship is in such rough weather, to imagine that the Chinese will put in a large amount of money into Afghanistan is, I think, unrealistic. So those are the geopolitical implications, and as yet we don't see any intensification of rivalry between the United States and China over Afghanistan. That, I think, has a different dimension, and it's on the other side, Taiwan, and I think there seems to be some kind of a tacit agreement between the United States and China that they don't want Afghanistan to become a focus because there's enough fighting anyway. And hopefully this will remain the case because we don't want another great power rivalry in that region. It's always very upsetting. Okay, now let me come to the impact of the Taliban victory in terms of the domestic situation in Pakistan, the internal situation. It's clear that the Taliban have placed very great reliance on Pakistan. It's, after all, a conduit, a land route for food and for fuel. Very recently, as you know, 50,000 tons of supplies, food, was allowed to be trucked across Pakistan from India, from essentially Wagah to Peshawar. So that is certainly one of Pakistan's role, to act as a conduit for the food and the fuel. But I'd say that equally it is in terms of how to manage the government over there. Pakistan has an inordinate amount of influence in Afghanistan because, after all, the Taliban were trained in Pakistani madrasas, but these madrasas are actually very, I'd say in modern terms, very primitive institutions. They are focused entirely upon religious matters and very little upon worldly matters, and in particular, how society is organized and how it should be done. And so those Taliban who were trained in these madrasas, whether they be in Peshawar or Quetta or Karachi, they are pretty clueless about how to run society. Now, this is an opportunity that people in the establishment, in the Pakistani establishment, see. They have been, as I said earlier, there has been a lot of triumphalism, and to the extent that now Afghanistan is seen as being essentially a fifth province of Afghanistan, of Pakistan. That may not be accurate, and I think that they will learn in time how inaccurate that is, but there, in this moment of triumphalism, there are still people in the establishment who think that way. So we had General Faiz Hamid of the ISI, the Director General of the ISI, who went there to give them advice on how to deal with the world and how to organize themselves. But the ISI is itself a fighting organization, basically. It's an intelligence organization, but it's not one that is trained. Its people are not trained how to deal with issues of electricity and fuel distribution, internet, communications, how to dispose of sewage, etc. And these are now problems that are facing Afghanistan because the people who manage them have, a good number of them have fled. It's hard to say how many capable people are left behind, but since already something like 500,000 have escaped from Afghanistan after the Taliban victory, it's clear that there's a serious skill deprivation over there. Now, it's not clear whether Pakistan can provide the missing technical expertise and whether it itself has the capability of doing so. And of course, there's a cultural difference over there. It is not that somebody from Pakistan can go along just across the border and start operating things over there, start managing things. That will certainly not be acceptable. And furthermore, it is only possible with those who speak the same language, so Pakhtuns, basically. It would, of course, have been much easier for Pakistan and for the people of Afghanistan if the Taliban had shown a definite desire to change. However, that willingness is still not evident. So the girls are still not back in school, and the attitudes of the Taliban are not helpful in this manner at all. Now, very recently, there was a visiting Taliban delegation to the University Grants Commission here. It's now called the Higher Education Commission. And I heard what the Taliban education leadership had to say. Now, here they were stressing that religious education, the madrasa education, was so much more powerful than the secular education that is received in the universities. So things like, okay, you can teach engineering and medicine and whatever else, but it's really the fact that faith had had made them triumph over all the odds, in spite of an enemy who had the best technology in the world. They had persevered and won. And so inevitably, this is going to have an effect upon Pakistan. And in fact, as we talk about what is the impact of the Taliban victory upon Pakistan, I'd say there is a reinvigoration of the jihadist groups which operate within the country. Immediately after the 15th of August, there was a celebration by the Lal Masjid group, Maulana Abdul Aziz, and they immediately put out the Taliban flag on top of their madrasa. There was a celebration which the government attempted to stop half-heartedly. I mean, they could easily have stopped it right there, but they did it half-heartedly. And even now, the Lal Masjid group is active. They are spreading their message across the city here in Islamabad. What is interesting is that after the Taliban victory, negotiations were immediately proposed with the Tehrik-e-Taliban Pakistan, the TTP, and it drew some protest within Pakistan from the opposition parties in particular, because the TTP had targeted the ordinary people in this country, the police, and the army. And in particular, they were responsible for that ghastly massacre of 130 children on the 16th of December 2014. But here was now Imran Khan saying that we should negotiate with them. In fact, Imran Khan has always had a soft corner for the Taliban and even for the TTP. He had proposed way back in 2013, I think, that the TTP be allowed to open offices across the country here in Pakistan. It was quite amazing because that was the time when the TTP was fully at war with the country against Pakistan. Another consequence has been a general emboldenment of the religious forces in this country. And so, although the TLP, Tehrik-Labbaik Pakistan, belongs to a different sect. So the TLP are the Barelvis, the TTP are the Deobandis, although they are at loggerheads with each other. But there is a feeling that among all religious groups that something good has happened in Afghanistan, as a consequence of which there has been a radical shift to the right in the country as a whole. And you see that a new national curriculum is now being imposed upon the entire country. Sindh is still resisting because education is a provincial subject. But now there is an increasing amount of religious material in the school curriculum. So in terms of impact on Pakistan internally, I think this is going to be the most severe one. Finally, let me just briefly say that there is a strong ethnic dimension here, which the Taliban victory is going to exacerbate. If we look at how the Taliban view the Durand Line, and let's remember that the Durand Line is something I think 1890 or something like that, which is when that demarcation took place. This much precedes the demand for Pakistan. And so when Allama Iqbal made his famous speech in 1930, he had pretty much accepted that the NWFP exists, Northwestern Frontier Province, as demarcated by the British exists. And so the demand for Pakistan by both Iqbal and Jinnah was for NWFP to be included. And so there was an absolute recognition of the Durand line. It is, as most national boundaries are, an artificial construct. However, it is not a natural construct because there are Pashtuns living on both sides of the border, and they have very close family ties going back and forth. And so it's a bit like Kashmir. You can draw a line, and the people on both sides are the same. Now, Pakistan has always been very fearful of that, and it hopes that a fence, a very now militarized fence, and a friendly Afghan Taliban will lessen the contact between Afghans on both sides. And so the national boundaries can be then solidified further, and claims for a united Pashtunistan will diminish. It's interesting that as one looks back over history, that even at the height of the fighting between the Taliban and the Afghan government, and I'm speaking about 1988, this is when Bacha Khan died. Bacha Khan died in Peshawar, but he was buried in Jalalabad. And both sides declared a ceasefire. The Afghan government and the Taliban, 1988, declared a ceasefire. And that was those were the bloodiest days. And so on both sides, there is a recognition of the Pashtun identity, which hasn't gone away. In fact, it's become, in many ways, quite a bit stronger with Afghan refugees spilling over into Pakistan. And this is actually one of the things that Pakistan dreads, that if there are more Afghan refugees coming across the border, that the Pashtun nationalism will get strengthened. So in conclusion, I'll say that Pakistan is hoping that the Taliban will be able to modernize and become capable of guided governance, guided under Pakistani tutelage. It is at the moment on every forum advocating that aid be restored unconditionally to feed Afghanistan's starving masses. And to my mind, this is a very serious moral problem. How does one help the Taliban? How does one help the Afghan people but bypass the Taliban? To my mind, this is the biggest challenge now emanating from Afghanistan, and it's a challenge for the world to act speedily before there is a humanitarian catastrophe. There is already a bad situation, but it is heading for a catastrophe. And I don't have the answer to that, but to my mind, it is the outstanding problem of the moment. Thank you.
Thank you, Pervez. Thank you for an excellent overview. I mean, I understand since you're going to have to catch your flight, maybe I can pose one or two questions to draw out some of the themes that you spoke about. You know, it has always struck me that in terms of countering the nationalist Pashtun narrative that you dwelt on, where you cited Basha Khan's demise and how there was a ceasefire. I remember even Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi, he had gone to Peshawar at that time for that particular to Jalalabad, if I remember right. Now, so Basha Khan's sort of thing was across boundaries in that sense and covered the entire subcontinent. But as a counter to the nationalist Pashtun, Pakistan has always, through the Mujahideen in the 80s and through the Taliban later on, has tried to raise the concept of the Islamist Pashtun, which then creates an issue, because what you're saying is that today, if they want the Taliban to change and shed some of the Islamist characteristics, so to say, and become a little more governance oriented, then it reverts to the nationalist part. So it's a kind of it's a dilemma.
I would absolutely agree. It's a dilemma. You see, there is, we all carry multiple identities. So an Afghan would say, yes, I'm a Muslim, but I'm also a Pashtun. I speak Pashto, and I belong to this tribe or that tribe. And that ethnicity, that tribalism is often, is sometimes dominant over the Islamic identification. And so, well, you see, if it was simple Islamic identification, then all of Afghanistan would be united. There would be all the different tribes over there, and from north to south, from east to west of Afghanistan, you would have people joined together. But that's not true, because there are these other conflicting identities as well, which is why people make say very rightly that Afghanistan is not a nation. It's a whole bunch of nations living together at the moment. And if a national identity emerges, it'll be after a long time.
That was Wali Khan, who once famously said that I have been a Pakistani for 43 years, a Muslim for 700 years, but a Pashtun for 2,500 years. So,
yes.
If there is anybody else who would like to ask Pervez any question before we let him go to catch his flight.
If you permit, Chair, I just had a brief question.
Sure.
Thank you, Professor Hoodbhoy, for that excellent and very informative sort of enlightening set of remarks that you made. My question is, to what extent would Pakistan be willing to intervene physically with boots on the ground in an open manner, overt manner, not the covert manner in which it has done so far, on the side of the Taliban that they might believe at some point of time is under duress from either other ethnic groups or the ISK, mostly for reasons to do with either the Taliban not being, no longer being seen as sufficiently radical by some, or as sufficiently inclusive in terms of the regime that they're setting up. So what is the extent to which the Pakistanis are willing to fill that void? You also said quite clearly that the Chinese will hesitate to step in with vast sums of money given the uncertainties.
I'd say there are very little chances that Pakistan would go in with boots on the ground inside Afghanistan, because this is not a war between armies. This would be intervening in a civil war. And this is something that the army, the Pakistan army, is simply not equipped for. They have first of all, it could only be done with the Pakhtuns in the Pakistan army. The Punjabis would be seen as outsiders in the same way that the Americans were seen as outsiders. And here, it's not clear whether there are enough such Pakhtuns in the Pakistan army who would be willing to do that. And then it would intensely divide loyalties within the army. And so the army high command wouldn't even entertain the risk of that. I'd also say that the Afghans are very nationalistic in the sense that they'll fight amongst themselves, but when they see someone coming from outside, they all join up together to fight the invader. And so, in short, I see very little chance that the Pakistan army will ever go in there in an open, manifest way. However, it could provide logistical support to the side which it supports, and it could give more than advice. It could give, let's say, drones or communication equipment, and perhaps help in intercepting communications and so forth, but not go there physically.
One question. Sorry, go ahead, Ashok.
Sir, I feel tempted to ask you one thing, Professor Hoodbhoy. You talked about many nations in Afghanistan, but I am reminded of an anecdote when Ahmad Shah Massoud's father died in Peshawar. He said, the territory belongs to us. We are Afghans. We are the Tajik. So that the sense of Afghanness is also there, which goes beyond the Pashtun majority identity of Afghanistan. So this is one thing that I just wanted to point out. But my question is, because there is no credible census as far as Afghanistan is concerned, but you would agree that, you know, the Pashtuns, Hazaras and Tajiks, between them, they constitute an effective minority. They are about almost 50% of the population. How is Pakistan going to relate to the non-Pashtun minority in Afghanistan in the coming days? Because as we look at the interim government or the caretaker government that Taliban have set up, out of 53 ministries, only about 10 go to the minorities. So in the days to come, because Taliban will have to make it more inclusive and bring in more minorities into the government. Otherwise, perhaps, you know, there will be an ethical question which will continue to agitate the minds of the international community or international actors as to whether to come in for humanitarian assistance or not. So in that sense, Pakistan being in the driver's seat for many reasons, how is it going to relate to the non-Pashtun minorities?
That's a great question. I don't know if I have a good answer to that. Look, if the Taliban were acting rationally and looking at the long term, they would certainly have they would have every nationality over there, and they would also, of course, agree to many of the demands of the international community, which is the principal one being let the girls go back to school. Now, it doesn't hurt them, does it? It is very much in their benefit that they be aided at this critical time. But are they thinking rationally? That is the whole issue, because their internal organization is such that, having fought the Americans for 20 years, they have a whole range. They have their own internal rankings in which it is seen who fought how much and gave what sacrifices. And in fact, those who gave their children as their sons as suicide bombers, they are high in the hierarchy. So rationally, yes, but in terms of their internal dynamics, it seems to me that they are not allowing rationality to to take center stage over there. And this is why they may find themselves in a situation of civil war. After all, I must say, to their having said all these negative things, there are places where they have softened their stance. For example, I had never heard of the Hazara Taliban, the Shia Taliban, but actually there is such a thing. Now, the Shias are someone that the Taliban have bitterly persecuted. And if you remember the massacres in Bamiyan immediately after the Taliban takeover in 1995, they were horrific. But now some Hazara Shia have called themselves Taliban, and they do so. There was a Washington Post article on this, which said that they understand they have to do this. They're not very happy about it, and they get very minor positions there. All the major positions and the major authorities with the Pashtun Taliban, but they have to do this for safeguarding their communities.
Thank you.
One last question, Pervez, if you are still there. One is, you know, I mentioned the fact that the ceasefire with the TTP seems to have collapsed, and at least Nur Wali Masood has announced that it is over, etc., etc. Because the terms of the ceasefire were, well, very similar to the terms that the Taliban got: release of prisoners in custody. And this time they wanted the TTP prisoners in Pakistan to be released. They said, well, give us our territory, particularly the what was the Fatah areas. And they said, divide up Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, give us back the Fatah, and we will run it as per Sharia, which obviously the government or the authorities in Pakistan said nothing doing, and the thing collapsed. So how does that go? Because after all, it was the Haqqanis who were acting as the mediators in this particular ceasefire.
Well, the TTP and the Afghan Taliban are ideologically identical. They both have fought for the Sharia, and and when the TTP was in Swat under Maulana Fazlullah and his father, what's his name anyway? So
Sufi, the Sufi Mohammad, if I remember.
Sufi
right.
Muhammad,
Father-in-law,
Sufi
father-in-law.
Yes,
His
father-in-law.
father-in-law. Yeah.
Yeah, Sufi Muhammad. So they had actually succeeded in Sharia system over there while they were running it. And then they got ambitious. Then they moved to Bunair. And then they were within striking distance of Islamabad. And that's the time when the Pakistan army swung into action and said, enough is enough. And so even though Imran Khan at that time was arguing that let's negotiate with them, the army said enough is enough. And then the action, Zarbeaz, started in earnest, and then 2014, the APS massacre happened and so forth. So the TTP has not changed its ideological position at all. And they say that if the Sharia is good for Afghanistan, it's good for Pakistan. And this the Pakistani establishment doesn't buy into. That's why, to my mind, this was a stillborn idea. There cannot be negotiations while these very ideological people are there. So the Haqqani group might be very beholden to Pakistan, and it will not take up arms against Pakistan, certainly. And of course, the intelligence agencies have got enough understanding of how they operate so that they will not allow them to be a threat. But TTP is another matter. I see open war now once again with them.
Oh, okay. Well, I think we will, unless there is somebody else who has a question, otherwise I think we can let Professor Hoodbhoy carry on with his packing and departure for Karachi.
So there are some questions in the Q&A box. There are two questions.
Wait, let me see. Okay. Well, we can't really have an assessment of the panel because
That is different.
we haven't had the panel discussion as yet. But I think the first one by Ambassador Yogendra Kumar has already been answered. I mean, we've just talked about the so-called agreement between TTP and Pakistan, which has collapsed. And is it possible for Taliban to use TTP as a pressure group to get its demands met, or try to dodge any pressure to behave from the Pakistani establishment? Well, that depends if the Pakistani establishment is putting any pressure on them or not. So,
yeah, this we have to remember that the agreement with the TTP was negotiated through the Afghan Taliban, and the Afghan Taliban have emerged as a mediator now. In terms of what it is that agreeing to the Afghan Taliban, I am not aware of any such demand. After all, Pakistan's been trying very hard to get them the international aid, to get the $10 billion released from Washington, and it's been criticized as being the foreign ministry of the Afghan Taliban. So I don't know if there is any kind of conflict now or unmet demands that the Taliban have made on Pakistan. I'm not aware of that, but then you have to be in the real know of things.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Pervez. I think this was a fascinating insight into how the dilemmas facing Pakistan in terms of the Taliban victory in Afghanistan. And I'm sure it is a situation that will continue to evolve over a period of time. It was wonderful to see you and wonderful to hear you. Thank you, and have a
Thank
safe
you.
flight.
And thank you, everyone. Thank you.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye, Pervez.
Thank you. Thank you.
Vishal, has Professor Sajjadpour joined us?
So we are trying to get him. Actually, Cisco WebEx is not allowed there. So we are looking for an alternative way of having him online.
We didn't know that earlier, or what?
We didn't know, sir. He kept
he also
trying
didn't
and
let us
he just
know.
informed us. It's not allowed in Tehran. It's not allowed. WebEx is not allowed there, sir. So we are trying to have him over, sir.
Oh, so how do we do that?
So,
through phone or something?
yeah, that's what we are trying, sir. And
On an audio link, at least.
We can go ahead with Dr. Wang Shida.
Yeah. Okay. So let me now invite Dr. Wang Shida. Dr. Wang is from the China Institute of Contemporary International Relations, where he has specialized in South Asian affairs. He has authored a number of books on Pakistan and Afghanistan. And Dr. Wang, I mean, we heard an interesting presentation in which the person who spoke before you, Professor Hoodbhoy, he said that the expectation in Pakistan was that China will help stabilize Afghanistan through its investment in the mineral resources, of exploitation of mineral resources, etc., etc. What is the expectation in China? How does China see its role in terms of the situation in Afghanistan? And I mean, how does it proceed, or how does it envisage? Because after all, the Taliban have been received by Foreign Minister Wang Yi, and they've had meetings on more than one occasion. How do they look at their role now? Over to you. You have 15 minutes, and we look forward to listening to your presentation.
Okay, thanks, Chair. Thanks, Ambassador Rakesh Sood. At first, I would like to thank Ambassador DG-IDSA, Mr. Sujan Chenoy, for giving me this kind and lovely invitation. And also great honor for me to see old friends from India, such as Dr. Ashok Bahuria, as well as other old friends. Long time no see, I should say, because the pandemic really changed a lot of things, not only in China, but I think all around the world. Just now, I think our friends, our common friends in Pakistan, just gave a very vivid explanation of Pakistan's maybe a kind of perspective on Afghanistan at now. And now I will try to try my best to give my, as a Chinese scholar, personal observation of what happens in Afghanistan after the August 15th. In fact, I'm preparing a presentation paper. The title of the paper is Afghanistan's Road to Peace and Development. I will first try to finish this paper. With Afghan Taliban regaining control of Kabul on August 15th and the US military's retreat from Afghanistan on August 30, I think a new page in the history of Afghanistan has been opened. This means that Afghanistan has finally restored its national sovereignty after a long period of external armed intervention and has independently established a new central government almost without external interference, let alone external control. It is a major event, not only for Afghanistan, but I think also for the entire region. In the foreseeable future, I believe no major powers is willing to intervene in Afghanistan on large scale again, because history has taught us a lot of lessons, like the UK in the 19th century, saw former Soviet Union in 20th century, while United States in 21st century. So that Afghan future really faces a great opportunities, but is still affected by many factors. I think the clue lies in whether Afghan Taliban, which has come to power again, can learn from the historic experience and the lessons of the previous central government and its first ruling period from 1996 to 2001, and handle the following relations, mainly three relationships. First, can Afghans abandon historical grievance, establish a political structure accepted by all the Afghan people, and unite all ethnic groups to work together for the peace and reconstruction? This is a big question. History has repeatedly proved that any single ethnic group or political group attempting to completely monopolize the political power of Afghanistan will inevitably be resisted and opposed by other ethnic groups and political organizations. If this kind of contradiction cannot be resolved, it will evolve into conflict and even lead to complete chaos at the national level. American strategist Brokinsky once pointed out that any constructive plan to resolve the conflict in Afghanistan must include two aspects. The first and foremost is that the Kabul regime must reach certain level of political reconciliation with the main domestic opposition. I think that is a very important sentence. On September 12, we all know that the Afghan interim government announced the government list of 53 people, which demonstrated a certain degree of inclusiveness, so-called inclusiveness. In my personal opinion, it is better than the first round of the government member. From the organizational analysis, the Taliban's internal factions leaders or members occupy the prime minister, the deputy prime minister, as well as the key ministerial positions. But in the meantime, we have to see that a small number of non-Taliban members have served as the head of some department. For example, the Ministry of Trade and the Minister of Health. So these two ministers do not think they have any factions or historical connections with Afghanistan. To a great extent, it is actually a technician. And also from the ethnic perspective, the September 2022 list include, I think, at least 13 non-platoon members, namely 4 Tajiks, 2 Uzbeks, 1 Turkmen, 1 Hazara, 1 Nuristani, and as well as others. Thus, to some extent, add to the representation of other ethnic groups. I think almost account for one-fourth of the total 53 numbers, while the platoons is still dominate the cabinet member. And also from the perspective of the gender, it's a pity that the government ministers are all male and no women hold positions, such as ministers or deputy ministers, which is in contradiction with the international, especially the Western society requirement for the Taliban regime. On the whole, the second round of the government list reflect inclusiveness, some kind of inclusiveness. I think Afghan Taliban aims to increase the number of technocrats and to improve the efficiency of governance. However, there are some kind of analysis believe that the second round of the list is mainly aimed to solve Taliban's internal faction balance problem and alleviating the internal power dispute caused by the first round of the government list. However, at least we get answering some kind of better list compared with the first round of government list. This is the first relationships. Second, whether Taliban can abandon extremism tendencies, embark on the path of moderate Islam, and resolutely combat terrorism. I think after the Afghan Taliban regained control of Kabul on August 15th, the international community, as well as the regional countries, generally proposed to eliminate terrorist shelters in Afghanistan and to prevent terrorist organizations from using Afghan territory to plan and carry out terrorist attacks against other countries, as well as separation from international terrorism. Also, this kind of anti-terrorism requirement has already become one of the prerequisite for the recognition of the legitimacy of the Taliban regimes. Obviously, whether Taliban can follow the path of moderate Islam and cut off from terrorism will decide whether the regime can be recognized internationally and regionally. Third, last but not least, whether Afghan Taliban can implement mild and stable domestic and foreign policies, actively interact and integrate with international community, strengthen cooperation with neighboring countries, and create a good, favorable external environment for its domestic development. In order to achieve peace and development, in addition to reaching political reconciliation with the main domestic opposition, the Kabul regime must reach a kind of regional level or regional framework with the major countries capable of promoting stability in Afghanistan. I think that is another precondition that U.S. scholar Brokinski just pointed out. At present, with withdrawal of U.S. troops and Taliban come back to power, I believe that the geopolitical situation in Afghanistan has undergone dramatic changes. In short, the U.S. dominance in Afghanistan has been completely broken. We all know that the U.S. will continue to play some kind of very important roles in Afghanistan, like the asset frozen, like the different levels of embargo, this kind of role that the U.S. will continue to play. But in the meantime, the regional countries have continued to increase their voice and extra influence in Afghanistan issues. The outlook for Afghan Taliban regime depends on whether it can maintain good relationships and interaction with regional countries such as Iran, Pakistan, Russia, as well as other regional countries. But there's a very big issue is that although the regional countries' influence in Afghanistan is increasing, but that does not mean that regional country is very easy to reach a consensus on Afghanistan. So that this kind of internal problems among different regional countries may, what should I say, create some kind of new problems for the Taliban regime. So that a very important problem, I think, Taliban regime have to face in the future. So in short, Afghanistan is at a critical stage from chaos to governance. The prospect of the Taliban government and the realization of peace, stability, and prosperity in Afghanistan depend on the Taliban to handle the above three relationships at least. In this process, I think as important neighboring countries and a member of a Security Council, China, together with other regional countries, has played and will continue to play some kind of active role and exert a positive influence on Afghanistan transition from chaos to governance. And that is my main statement, and thanks for your patience. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Wang. But would you like to? You still have time. You've got more than 5 minutes left. So, how does you? I know. No, you've spoken about the challenges for the Taliban government, and you've spoken about that their second list was more encouraging, etc. But what about Chinese investment? What about Chinese? China's efforts in terms of stabilizing. There are reports that you've been seeking some kind of a military or armed police, security police kind of an outfit somewhere in Badakhshan or on the tri-junction of Tajikistan, Badakhshan, and China, because particularly with regard to the Uyghurs, the ETIM, and so on. So would you like to tell us a little bit about how China is looking at the situation and the efforts that China is making? Because in a sense now, the Americans are gone. So it's basically for the countries of the region to sort out.
Thanks for your very important question. I would like to respond simply. First and foremost, I think history already tells us several times that Afghanistan issue. I would prefer to use the word Afghan issue rather than Afghan problems. The Afghan issue cannot be solved by any particular country, let alone U.S., former Soviet Union, and the UK. That is my first comment. Second comment is that you see, 20 years ago, it is not China who starts a war and bring this kind of, what should I say, a lot of issues happens in Afghanistan. United States really invests billions of US dollars in Afghanistan and really do a lot of things in the social and economic reconstruction in Afghanistan. But we have to point out that after 20 years, Afghanistan did not become more stable than 1990s. So that is my second comment. I think the countries who created these kind of problems have to continue to shoulder the due responsibility. The second issue, the third comment is about the China's rules. I think China's rules in Afghanistan has been quite clear. I think first and foremost, I think the political measures or political solution is always, I think, China's side proposed to solve the issue. We can see that in the past 2 or 3 months, China hosts or draw a lot of meetings, either international or regional meetings in Afghanistan. For example, China, I think, joined the 2 rounds of 6+ Afghanistan meeting, which include all Afghanistan's 6 direct neighboring countries. And also China joins the G20s, as well as SCOs, as well as other international organizations, special summit of Afghanistan. On this kind of different, either international or regional forum, China pointed out several times that is the core or the future of Afghanistan really lies whether the Afghan people can find a political solution among themselves. That is, I think, first and foremost. Secondly, I think economic measures is always a very important area that China would like to play in Afghanistan. We all know that China have some invested several joint projects in Afghanistan, and because of, you see, the security issues or the cultural heritage issues, this kind of project did not succeed up till now. But I think in the future, with the Kabul regime become more and more stable, and with Kabul regime relationship with other countries, including United States, become more and more stable and optimistic, I think it's kind of great potential for China to restart some kind of joint project in Afghanistan. Also, I think India, as well as other countries, also have this kind of similar investment project in Afghanistan. I think Afghan Taliban regime already, I think, give a very positive attitude towards this kind of investment already existed in Afghanistan. So that is economic. Last but not least, talk about security. You see that as Chinese scholar, you must know that Chinese scholar is very reluctant to talk about security issues because on the first hand, it is against our so-called the guidelines of our diplomacy. Because without the UN security mandate, China is very reluctant to provide even one soldier overseas. So that this kind of so-called security troops, even police or armed policemen in northeast part of Afghanistan or Pakistan or other province, according to my humble knowledge, it not be true. But China definitely would like to provide some kind of related assistance to the regime, Kabul regime. You see that even before August 15th, so China provided some kind of this kind of security assistance to the what should I say, the Mr. Ghane's government. But nowadays, it is Afghan Taliban's retake the Kabul. But whether what kind of security interactions will be between China and this kind of regime, I'm not quite sure, frankly speaking, because it is still in the process. But based on the history, you see that I think provide some kind of certain levels of assistance, including economic assistance, including some kind of transportation vehicles. I think that kind of assistance should not face a big problems. I think that is my simple response to your question.
Thank you. Thank you. I think we can move on. I think we'll take the questions at the end. So, Vishal, if Professor Sajjadpour is available, then we can invite Professor Sajjadpour.
I think we are yet to have him with us, so we may as well go ahead with Dr. Akram Umarov.
No, I thought next was Dr. Jalali.
Bahar Jalali hasn't joined yet.
She also hasn't joined.
Hasn't joined.
Oh, I see.
Alexey
Professor Sajjad will be joining us through a WhatsApp video call, sir, in 5 minutes. So.
Who? Sorry?
Professor Sajjad will be joining us, sir, in 5 minutes through a WhatsApp call, sir. I will be casting his screen to this meeting window, sir.
Okay, okay. So maybe we can move to Dr. Akram Umarov, who is an expert on Central Asia and has been a professor in Tashkent and is also a visiting scholar at the University of Pittsburgh in Pennsylvania. So, Dr. Akram, welcome. And you've been listening to the Chinese perspective, the Pakistani perspective, and so on. So perhaps you can give us a flavor of, I think it is quite clear to say that there is not one Central Asian perspective, because I think the Tajiks look at things differently from the Uzbeks, which is different from the Turkmens and so on. And so perhaps you can give us an idea about the complexity of how the Central Asian states are looking at the developments, what kind of concerns, and what would they like to, how would they like to stabilize the situation? Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Sood, and I'm very privileged to be a part of this panel and to talk on issues related to Afghanistan and kind of Central Asian perception of the current situation in Afghanistan. It's extremely interesting, especially to talk after hearing perspectives from Pakistan and China. And maybe I will focus more on security issues comparing with my colleague from China. I will talk maybe more on from security perspective, which is our major concern when we talk about Afghanistan. So, Ambassador Sood, you mentioned correctly, while
my first point was kind of it's now a kind of common perception of Central Asia has a bit division on how to look on Afghanistan, how to act towards Afghanistan, what kind of policy to conduct in this direction. So there is a vision that Tajikistan kind of versus the rest of Central Asia. So 4 Central Asian nations, like Uzbekistan, especially Turkmenistan as direct neighbors of Afghanistan, then to less extent Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan now engaging to some extent with Taliban, providing some humanitarian support. They conducted some bilateral meetings. There was visits of official representatives of these countries to Kabul, especially Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan sent delegation on the level of foreign ministers, which is a very important sign of establishing relations. So Tajikistan is having more kind of anti-Taliban rhetoric and pushing the idea that there is no balance in the government, there is no representation of other ethnicities which are very important in Afghanistan, especially Tajik representatives. But at the same time, this is a kind of perception from the outset. But at the same time, despite all these challenges, despite all this anti-Taliban rhetoric and all the difficulties in relations, Tajikistan is still continuing to provide electricity to this country, despite this government changes, regime changes in this country, and then trade connections maybe a slightly lower level, but still they are continuing. They are not completely banned from any trade with counterparts on Afghanistan side. So Tajik entrepreneurs have still have relations on trade issues with their Afghan partners. So and it's very similar to the approach which other Central Asian countries are now conducting. So they're mainly emphasizing not on just recognizing Taliban, they're emphasizing more on restoring this trade relations and expecting from Taliban to provide security and stability. And from the Tajik perspective, why it's happening, Tajikistan has such rhetoric. Of course, there is many internal issues, and there is a role of the leader of the country who has some ambitions. But at the same time, we should underline the fact that Tajikistan is probably the only country among the neighbors of Afghanistan, the immediate neighbors of Afghanistan, who has never conducted official meetings with Taliban before this takeover. So if you look on the history of Taliban and relations with Central Asian countries or other neighbors of Afghanistan, the Taliban had some exchanges, some meetings on official level with Iran, with Pakistan, with China, with Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, before this takeover in August. But with Tajikistan, at least on official level, the information about this has never appeared in the media that there was a meeting between Tajikistani and Taliban representatives at some point. So there is a lack of these connections and the historical connections, and also Tajikistan has some historical experience of back in 1990s during the civil war period. So some part of the Tajik opposition groups had bases, platform in Afghanistan, and they used Afghan soil for conducting some operations. And definitely Mr. Rahman is still remembering these issues, and he's still considering these issues while he's evolving a new policy towards Afghanistan. So I think Tajikistan is very attentive, careful, and with his historical experience and considering the possibilities of that some kind of forces can find a very convenient soil in Afghanistan and conduct some terroristic attacks against the country. And also it's a good point for Tajikistan to get kind of subjectivity, agency in international relations. You could see how now Tajikistan is actively involved in international issues related to Afghanistan. The Tajik leader was invited to several official visits to European countries, despite the previous critique of his actions and his regime about democracy and all these kind of issues. and Tajikistan became a kind of very important actor for many Western countries due to its current rhetoric. But at the end of the day, I would say that there is no substantial difference between the Tajik perspective on Afghanistan and Uzbek, Turkmen, or other Central Asian countries. There are differences in approaches, but I think there is common understanding that Central Asia is expecting from Taliban to provide security and stability, especially on the north of the country, which is direct neighborhood with Central Asia, to reduce or eliminate, hopefully at some point, drug trafficking. And the third point, which among expectations, is to deal with terrorist groups which are originated from Central Asia. So they have representation in Afghanistan, like Islamic Movement of Turkestan or Ansarullah for Tajikistan, or also Daesh is a concern for Central Asia. The fact that Daesh is now especially active in this country is issue of concern. Also, we should not forget the fact that after the withdrawal, the Western forces, huge amount of weaponry was left in this country without any control. So we are still, it's still not clear who is controlling it, what kind of actions these weapons can take, and what will the fate of these weapons. It's a big question, and there is a hope that at least as Taliban is declaring that it's controlling the country, it should deal with these issues and prevent any kind of uncontrolled weaponry transfer within Afghanistan, especially to the region of Central Asia. There are also expectations that the projects and the trade level which Central Asia reached before this takeover, so all the neighboring countries from Central Asia had very extensive trade relations with this country, and it was mainly beneficial for them because it was mainly consisted of export to Afghanistan rather than import from this country. Very small level of import, but mainly export. So this different companies, entrepreneurs in Central Asia benefited considerably from this trade relations. And there is a hope that we should somehow try to revive this trade relation. And also Central Asia is now trying to connect with South Asia via Afghanistan. There was a big event in Tashkent which was supported by other Central Asian countries. There is the idea of Central and South Asia connectivity, which is obviously impossible without the role of Afghanistan, without Afghanistan being this bridge connecting these regions and providing transit opportunities for the region. And considering these projects which are famous, like railway from Uzbekistan to Pakistan, or this long discussed gas pipeline from Turkmenistan to India going through Afghanistan and Pakistan. These are all projects which are still considered by Central Asian countries and which are they trying now to discuss with Taliban. But definitely Taliban is facing many problems before kind of having these relations and having been capable to implement these decisions. And first of all, there is a big issue is definitely its recognition by international community. But while now Taliban is seeking international recognition, I would say that they are missing the fact that they have actually still they have no internal recognition. So from the point of Taliban, from this ideological perspective, they have this legitimacy given by religious factors. But if we come from the perspective of international community, so they are still representatives of Taliban movement rather than Afghan nation. So they need some kind of the compromise. They need to conduct some kind of internal legitimization, so Loyola or some council, whatever they prefer, and what kind of legitimization they would decide to go forward with. And also there is many signs coming about the internal divisions within Taliban. There are a variety of fractions, and there are collision of interests, priorities. So different fractions and different visions on how Taliban should evolve, to what extent it should compromise with the current requirements of the international community for recognition, and what kind of policy it should design, internal and foreign policy, in order to be accepted to this international community. And there are many signs that there is no internal consolidation and understanding how to do this. Especially if you look on several examples when one part of Taliban was traveling abroad, conducting diplomatic negotiations to persuade the country that we changed, we are not the same power which we had back in 1990s. We're moderate. At the same time, like the groups led by Haqqani are conducting meetings with former kind of with the families of Taliban members who participated in different terroristic attacks and who became victims of these attacks. So sending a message that their ideology is foremost and they're not going to change it or to update it under the pressure of international community. So this is important development. The next issues which Central Asia is concerned about, I think, to what extent is Taliban really independent? And what is the limits of their decision-making power? Are they fully independent in decision-making, or they have to listen to some external forces before making some decisions? So it's important to understand. Also, we can see many signs of incapability to organize public institutions and difficulties with governance, and they're also not they're not controlling fully the situation. We can see that still terroristic attacks are happening. Daesh is quite active, but also from other perspective, who knows? Maybe Daesh is now used as a kind of for alternative to Taliban, to show international community, if you do not support and you're not ready to accept Taliban, you can have something worse like Daesh. So they can come to the power. Would you like to have such partner on the side of Afghanistan instead of Taliban? Maybe Taliban is a better option than Daesh. So there is some such kind of perception. And finally, I think Taliban needs it needs some kind of desecuritization, internal desecuritization. So to share this image that they're actually controlling the country and they have responsibility on this country. So conducting military parades on this stage, I think, give no credibility or additional points to Taliban. I think they can. We all know that they could win in this war. They had military victory on this war. It's enough. So what's the reason to conduct like military parades in Kandahar or other places to try to show their power? We are aware of their capability. And finally, despite all this engagement from Central Asian side, I personally would be a bit cautious and wouldn't put all eggs in one basket. It's still not very clear what kind of situation we will have in a half-year period, in 1 year period, considering this dramatic situation now in Afghanistan, to what extent Taliban can deal with this and can fix it in such short period. Of course, it received not very good heritage from the previous government, but anyway, if they're declaring their responsibility and their readiness to govern the country, they need to find some solutions, especially the immediate ones. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Thank you, Professor Umarov, for an excellent presentation. I think we have some questions, but I'm just told that Professor Sajjadpour is able to join us. Since we've been waiting patiently for him, I think we'll go straight to Professor Sajjadpour. Professor Sajjadpour, it is wonderful to see you. Can you hear me? Professor Sajjadpour, are we? Is it audible?
Need to fix his volume, I think.
Yeah, his camera has gone off. Hi. Welcome. Welcome, Professor Sajjadpour.
Can you hear me?
Camera off, microphone off. Yes, we can see you now. Oh. Why have we muted his call? Don't.
Do you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you. Why are we muting his call?
Sir, please unmute your call, sir. Sajjad, sir, please unmute your WhatsApp call.
No, it is an Indian number, Sujan. I think the call
Piyush,
is,
please look into this. Piyush,
I think the
Webmaster, please
call
look
is
into
being
it.
made from this end.
Piyush, I think you are muting it. No.
Professor Sajjad, you have muted your call from your end. Please unmute your WhatsApp call.
Can you hear me?
It's.
Can you hear me? Okay. Do you see me also?
Does he need to put it on speakerphone, Piyush? Will that help you?
Put it on mic.
If you hear me, I continue. Sorry. If I'm sure
Piyush, we can hear him, but you need to get his volume up. Will it help to have him on speaker?
Sir, he's on speaker, sir.
All right. Does it help the other way around?
Yeah.
Anyway, think of something on the fly. May I suggest to the chair that he could consider moving to the next speaker, and then maybe Piyush can iron out these technical differences.
Okay, we can do that. If Dr. Jalali has joined, then perhaps I can get her in. Otherwise, we move to Alexey. Has Dr. Jalali joined?
Sir, she's not available. Like we tried to reach her a couple of times. She's not taking call also.
All right. So we'll see. Alexey, all yours.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood.
I
Can you
mean, I
hear me?
don't need to introduce you, I think, to this audience, because I'm sure everybody knows you, at least as somebody who has spent a long time working on Afghanistan and South Asia, and he's the head of the group on South Asia, Indian Ocean, with the IMEMO in Moscow, the World Economy and International Relations Institute, which is part of the Russian Academy of Sciences. So, Alexey, over to you. Maybe you can tell us how Russia is looking at it, because Russia was my good friend, Ambassador Kabulov. I read very carefully to all his interviews and statements where he said that the US must leave, but now the US has left. So Russia is now looking at it, things slightly differently, I think. We saw some of the increased strengthening of border controls, etc., with with the government in Tajikistan military exercises. We've also seen some new statements coming out by, and then more recently, National Security Advisor, Mr. Patrushev was here for a conference, and so we saw all that. So tell us how Russia is now looking at these things.
Thank you, Ambassador Sood. Can you hear me? Is it okay?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. Fine.
Okay. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here. It's not easy to speak after such wonderful speakers. I'll try to not to repeat the previous speakers, so my presentation will be shorter than I planned. First of all, speaking on Russian position on Afghanistan, we need to understand the main imperatives that underlie it. The first thing, key imperative is stability and tranquility, because Russia needs a stable and calm Afghanistan, where there is no war, where military detachments do not come from, and flows of refugees do not flee to the Central Asia region. My colleague Irina Zvegelska, I know, yesterday described the imperatives of Central Asian players, as well as previous speaker. Now, so Moscow understands these imperatives, on the whole supports them, and is interested in keeping Central Asia stable. So the border of Russia with the Central Asia is permeable. Recently, a border observation system was built there, but this system can stop single violators and smugglers, but not groups of militants who decided to break through this border. And so Russian southern border with Afghanistan, in fact, is a border along the Punch. And the security of this border is extremely important to us. We cannot allow the supply of weapons, so people with these weapons, to cross this border. The second imperative is related to the geopolitical situation in the world, because Russia is currently under pressure from the United States, the European Union, their allies, and these players are unfriendly. They use a friendly rhetoric, openly declare the intentions not to recognize our elections, and try to oust Russia from the market and from the regions, and almost directly threaten military conflict. In this situation, Russia has an extremely negative perception of the presence of the United States and NATO on its southern border. And finally, the third imperative is Russian concerns about the drug trafficking from Afghanistan, because I know that many Russian countries react to the drug problem less acutely, but Russia is not only a present space for these drugs, but its population are consumers of these drugs. For us, it's very important. And so Russia views the situation in Afghanistan based on these three imperatives. And it forms, Russia forms this attitude towards the players' proceedings from these imperatives. Of course, Russia would be more comfortable with a secular and friendly government in Kabul. But the government of Ashraf Ghani behaved defiantly anti-Russian, accused Russia of having links with the Taliban, and groveled in front of the United States, from our point of view, of course. In these conditions, Russia could not place a stake on him, and the idea of establishing contacts with the anti-Taliban resistance, acting as an honest broker, looked promising, but the anti-Taliban resistance ended very quickly. So we now have no other alternative but to develop relations with the Taliban. And we are not sure the Taliban will last and that the Taliban will fulfill their obligations. And for this reason, Russia does not remove the Taliban status as a terrorist organization. But so far, everything indicates that the arrival of, the victory of Taliban is perceived by the Afghan population calmly and with the hope of ending this endless war. And so we must proceed, it seems to me, from two possible scenarios. The first implies that the Taliban will not be able to cope with the internal problems, and either a new round of war will begin in Afghanistan between the factions of Taliban, or we will see maybe a new insurgency. And the second one implies that the Taliban will be stable and will be able to organize the working system of government. And the implementation of these scenarios depends not only on its internal reasons, but also on the Taliban neighbors. If we fight against the Taliban, training anti-Taliban militants and camps in our territory and supplying weapons to the disaffected ones, then we probably of the first scenario will increase. Probability, I'm sorry, for the first scenario will increase. If we help the Taliban to establish themselves by gently influencing them, the likelihood of the latter will increase. And these scenarios are not mutually exclusive and depend primarily on the further actions of Taliban. In Russian political discourse, the second option is still considered more likely. Because from Moscow perspective, New Delhi overestimates the Taliban dependence on Pakistan, because the Taliban, by the very logic of Afghan politics, will be pushing for a break with Pakistan, taking into account the mass unresolved issues. Refugees, well, from refugees to the borderline issue, the problem is the Durand line. So we can help the Taliban to become a full-fledged Afghan power. And it seems to me that it's a key issue that should be discussed with each other by the neighbors of Afghanistan. Afghanistan now is very vulnerable, but we are also very vulnerable to the possible expansion of radical ideas, weapons, and drugs from its territory. And we need to try to build a balance and maintain it constantly. It's difficult, but I think necessary. But the main thing that I would suggest is to look at the processes taking place in Afghanistan from the point of view of long-term development of Afghan society. The most important thing that we must remember is that Afghan society is now in the process of long-term transformation, and war is not the cause, but the consequences of this process. And I would suggest looking at this process as a regional trend, a kind of maybe conservative revolution, when people willingly use the achievements of progress of civilization and at the same time looking for basis in traditional values, in religion, in big family, so on. And so you can call it autumn modernity, and something like that happened some decades ago in Iran, and similar processes are now going, I think, in China and India. And in Afghanistan, they took on simply an ugly form due to the specific of Afghan society. And because the society is essentially medieval and suddenly found itself under the enormous pressure of modernity. And we have two paths before us. First, we can either support this autumn modernity in Afghanistan, making sure that it does not take ugly forms. That means gently influencing Taliban and Taliban regime and trying to create maybe more modern society there. Or we can try to fundamentally break the tradition of the society, persistently promoting the values of modernity and the expectation that the consciousness of Afghans are suddenly transformed and they will wholeheartedly embrace secular democratic values. But I'm afraid that in the second case, we will try to swim against the current. So that's all.
So Professor Sajjadpour will join us through an audio call, sir.
Okay, Alexey, have you finished?
Yes, sir.
Okay, thank you. Okay, let's listen to Professor Sajjadpour if he is now available.
Sir, you're in the meeting, sir.
Okay. I can hear you.
Hello, Professor Sajjadpour.
Yes, yes, good morning.
Hello, Professor Sajjadpour.
Hello. Yes, yes. Hear you.
Hello, Professor Sajjadpour, can you hear me? I don't know, Sujan, what do
Piyush,
you advise?
are you getting him online, Piyush?
We'll let the webmaster take a call on it.
Sir, he's online, sir.
No, but
He may not be getting your voice, but if he speaks,
how,
let us see whether we can hear it.
well, I mean,
Piyush?
Piyush, are you able to simply raise him on WhatsApp or on an audio call and then feed that over your speakerphone into the mic at this end? Can you do that?
Yeah, I have tried, sir, but I think there is an issue with the connection stream, I think, sir, sometime because of the audio bandwidth is also not so good, sir.
Simple audio bandwidth?
Is not good, sir.
Okay.
okay.
Do you have any other options?
He can hear us, sir, but his voice is not that too loud and too clear.
It doesn't help us for him to hear us. We want to hear him.
Yeah. Well,
all right, Chair, I think your call.
I think that, well, we've tried with Professor Sajjadpour. I mean, it's a little unfair, to keep him sort of, because I'm sure he has other commitments as well. So we can't just keep him hanging like this. So maybe we should just do without the Iranian perspective on, unless any of our other speakers, either Alexey or Professor Umarov, would like to talk a little bit about how they see the Iranian reaction to it. I mean, obviously we won't quiz them on it, but perhaps we can just to round off the picture, and then we can move to a Q&A. Is that, if that is all right, Sujan, that's all right?
Of course.
Okay, so then please tell Piyush that, he should just convey our apologies for not having been able to get the benefit of Professor Sajjadpour's opinion, and we'll move on. Alexey, have you been in touch with some of your Iranian counterparts recently, or Professor Umarov, if you've been in touch with some of your Iranian counterparts and would like to give us a bit of an idea as to how the Iranians are looking at things?
I'm afraid, sir, I'm not ready. I apologize. I will be glad if Professor Umarov sheds light on this issue.
Okay.
I'll be very brief. Unfortunately,
sure.
I was not in touch with my Iranian colleagues, but I have followed the news and what's happening on Iranian side. So I think the relations between Iran and Taliban has completely changed if you compare them with the period of 1990s when Taliban was first time in the power. So there is no such not a complete an acceptance from both sides. So during the years, because of this common enemy from them, they found many things in common and even cooperated. We know that even at some point on the Iranian side, they supported the establishment of one of Taliban shuras. So Mashhad Shura was functioning on Iranian territory, and one of the previous leaders of Taliban movement, before Akhundzad, Mullah Mansour, he actually was killed while he was returning from Iran. It shows the level of cooperation when the Taliban leader is quite frequently visiting the country and conducting some, possibly conducting some meetings and negotiations. And the utmost kind of interest of Iran, I think, in the victory of Taliban was the fact that Western forces completely withdrew from the country. So this was the biggest concern from Iran, having huge Western presence in the time of big tensions between Iran and West on the Iranian nuclear program. Having such big military presence on its direct neighborhood was perceived as a threat for Taliban, for Iran, sorry, especially having big air bases which were very close to Iranian territory, like several minutes of flight from these bases to Iranian territory was a big military threat for Iran. But and this pushed Iran to establish links with Taliban, and now, especially the recent border incident, showed that Iran is not trying to make some additional tensions with Taliban. Despite this misunderstanding and shots from both sides, they tried to calm down the situation and to find some peaceful solution for this. They didn't try to exaggerate this issue or to try to use some military facilities for this. I think the expectation from Iranian side is quite similar with other neighbors of Afghanistan. So they're expecting more stability, more security, and more predictness. So they're expecting that this force will be more predictable and more reliable and credible to work with. To what extent this will be true in reality, it needs time to assess. For now, this, I think, very briefly, my assessment of what Iran is Iranian perspective, and they are, I think, quite fine with the fact that Taliban could defeat Western forces, and especially the government, which was supported by them, and now is establishing some links with neighboring countries. But of course, not everything is so positive. There are still issues, especially the ones which we mentioned earlier about the role of Shia community in Afghanistan, and the fact that they are still not very in big favor of Taliban, let's say this way, and they are not very included in the current governance structures in Afghanistan. And there are also some information that actually there are some tensions are arising now between Taliban and Hazara minority.
Yes, thank you. I mean, we have, in fact, the last point you made leads me to a question. I remember hearing from some of my Iranian friends a few months ago that they were obviously very concerned about the fate of the Hazara community. And our Chinese friend, Professor Wang, told us that, there are some Hazara Taliban or Shia Taliban also included in the governance structures. But I remember my Iranian friend telling me about the Fatimiyun Brigade, which are the Hazaras who had gone to fight in Syria and are battle hardened, have come back, and they are therefore, in case things get difficult or things get difficult for the Hazara community, there will be armed resistance by what was known as the Fatimiyun Brigade of the Afghan Hazaras, who are now probably equipped and battle trained and can take on the Taliban militarily. Have you also heard something like that, Professor Umarov?
Yeah, yes, there's definitely a discussion that Iran used Afghan citizens with Hazara background to form some military units to fight in Syria, and they are still capable to conduct some military activities. But they definitely can use this as kind of leverage, but I don't think that Taliban is scared of such leverage. Of course, it's still in the agenda, but trying to use this in the current situation wouldn't be very in line with current Iranian policy towards Taliban. So they're expecting from Taliban more positive things. Of course, if they do not see this, they can be evolving new problems. And it's not just Fatimiyun Brigade or Shia minority. There is also the role of Tajik groups, so political elite. So we know that Iran was very and in close cooperation with Northern Alliance, especially with its Tajik part back in 1990s, and many Tajik warlords or political leaders were supported by Iran. There is still this option as well. Now we can see that this national resistance movement, so-called national resistance movement, couldn't bring a big support from external forces. It's also a sign that they are not ready for now to try to resist Taliban. They're expecting from them some positive steps towards each of these actors, expecting some positive steps. But in case it will not happen, they all of these partners have something an alternative. So Iran has this Fatemiyun and Tajik groups. Other partners can also find some other issues in order to find some leverage on Taliban.
Chair, if I may just butt in here with a small suggestion, since we couldn't get Professor Sajjadpour online, we have our own in-house scholar, Dr. Deepika Saraswat, who deals with Iran. So if you permit, with your kind indulgence, you may kindly invite her to speak for about 5 minutes on Iran's view of the changes. She's a last-minute addition. She will make some extempore remarks. We've already made her a panelist. And likewise, perhaps you might consider Dr. Adil Rashid. He could say a few words about, he works on counter-radicalization, counter-terrorism, and he too may have something to add by way of value to this discourse. If Dr. Mudassar Kamar is available from our institute, but unfortunately he's not, he could have added something on the Turkish side. But it's your call, Chair. I'm simply giving you a couple of options.
I'm happy to invite whoever is there. I think we heard a little bit about Turkey yesterday from in the afternoon session from Dr. Panier and the others. So maybe we can listen to, you said Deepika Saraswat, and she can speak for 5 minutes, and then we'll see if we want to move. There are some questions that I see in the Q&A also. So it'll give us time for discussion. So perhaps we can invite Deepika Saraswat to tell us a little bit, although I think Professor Umarov did cover the shift in the Iranian stance in terms of keeping some cards up its sleeve and waiting and watching to see how the Taliban make good on their commitments in terms of the treatment of minorities.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. So I would just add up a little bit to what Professor Umarov has argued about the shift that we've seen in last few weeks or last few months, actually. I mean, yes, the current dispensation in Iran is very reluctant and sort of has a policy of strategic patience, if I may say. I mean, they are waiting and watching how Taliban is consolidating and how the Taliban is looking at Iranian concerns, especially about the Hazara minority and also the border, the security of the border. I think that's also a very important concern as far as Iran is concerned, because it's a huge border of nearly 1,000 kilometers. So, I mean, last few weeks, we actually saw that along the border, there was some kind of exchange of fire, because it's Atish, which is the army that is responsible for guarding the borders. But we've seen over the months that IRGC has also, become active, and Iran is very much concerned about drug trafficking and smuggling. So on those issues, I think there are serious concerns as far as Tehran is concerned. And I would just say a little bit about the Fatemiyun Brigade. I mean, of course, that's a strong leverage that Iranians have, IRGC has in Afghanistan, but they've been very reluctant. I mean, they do not want to be caught in a sectarian quagmire, so to say. So, I mean, there are no serious indications that that Iranians would like to use that card anytime. They do want Taliban to probably stabilize, because they've seen that how Taliban has taken on Americans over the years. They have no intention to become even indirectly involved militarily in any way. That's my understanding. And but I think this border issue, the incoming of refugees, that's also another concern that Iranians will probably have to see over time and how it's unfolding. I mean, if the humanitarian situation remains dire as it is, I mean, the problem of refugees is also going to become a very serious one for Iranians. So that's the third point I think I'll make here. So for now, I think these are the 3 points that I'd like to bring on the table. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Adil, would you like to?
Yes, sir.
Sure.
Am I audible, sir?
Yes.
I think I would like to highlight some of the problems which the Taliban itself, because of its sudden position of being the force in power and trying to govern the country, it is facing right now. The contradiction of being, first of all, a terrorist organization, trying to now gain international legitimacy, and also in the process trying to somehow keep links with its old jihadist friends. That is the huge dilemma which Taliban would be facing, and that would be a great challenge for it. Even when it comes to China, and I have put this question in the Q&A box, I was trying to ask the Chinese expert on this. China wanted Taliban to take more assertive action against the ETIM members within Afghanistan, because the ETIM had its base in Afghanistan during the time when the Ghani government was around. But now China is asking the Taliban to take action against these people because they are endangering Chinese interests in the region. And so Taliban has only so far told the Chinese that they have just advised their jihadist brethren to move out of the country. So that is not a very reassuring sign for China. The same problems it would face with other countries in the region. And the breakdown of the talks with the TTP, between trying to mediate talks between Pakistan and TTP, is another setback for the Taliban, because Taliban, if it wants to champion itself, something like to some extent, if we can say, Qatar tries to bring some of the Islamist elements closer to the Western world, becoming a place for mediation. If Taliban had ever thought that it could play that role, it could be very counterproductive for it, and it could not deliver to any of the parties involved. And that in itself will make it, and ISK has been trying to harp on this very point, that once you have come to this place of power, you have lost your ideological moorings and you are not one of us nowadays. And the same problem it will face from the international community. And so its own internal contradictions would grow with time. And this is, in fact, a very destabilizing situation. The other problem is that without a very assertive political leadership, whenever you have a very ideological movement, one needs a very strong charismatic leader on the top. If you have a very conciliatory and leadership which is not very clear as to what is its policy, you will find such groups collapsing very soon. And so Taliban is definitely facing a major crisis in the months to come. I would just say this much.
Okay, thank you. Well, I don't know if anybody has had any personal interactions face-to-face with the Taliban leadership to be able to give us a flavor of how charismatic they are. But I doubt if that is the case, so we shall just leave that. I had personally never met Mullah Omar, so from all accounts, I can't vouch for how charismatic he was, but he did keep the Taliban. He did provide a very unified chain of command, which is something that doesn't seem to exist in today's Taliban, certainly. Professor Umarov, there is a question here that you had mentioned the Tapi pipeline project in your speech. I mean, are there any chances that this project will ever see the light of day? I mean, because how does Taliban, which has been unable to, establish, after all, we know there have been a number of terrorist attacks in Kandahar, in Kunduz, in Kabul, and so on. In the absence of providing security for a vital infrastructure project like this, and it's not something that can be just done very quickly, is there likelihood that this will see the light of day?
Yeah, thank you for this question. For now, it's of course, it's very difficult for any project, not just Tapi, for any project somehow evolve in Afghanistan due to the existing restrictions. So no one is ready to invest in the country any dollar, not talking about billions of dollars for the projects like Tapi. It depends to many issues which we earlier mentioned, that if Taliban could keep the power, if Taliban demonstrates its capability to control the situation, to provide some security guarantees, or if again we can see the new vicious cycle of civil war. Of course, any projects, not just Tapi, would be put for another hold for the next decade. I think for now it's of course Tapi or any other project, big project which were planned in this country, they're on hold. They're because of this uncertainty, and the current talks on this with Taliban is just to get understanding to what extent is Taliban is ready to cooperate on these issues. It's just to investigate this situation. Is Taliban is ready? If ready, then there will be a period of the acknowledgement possible of Taliban and the gradual return of some international organizations. Then possibly we can see any kind of development for any such big infrastructure projects.
You also mentioned something about the fact that Tajikistan, even though they have taken there has been a lot of rhetoric vis-a-vis the Taliban regime in Kabul, but you mentioned that they have continued trade in the sense of power supply, power. I mean, how much is the trade between Tajikistan? I mean, if you have any idea.
So before this before the August 2015, the actual trade level between Tajikistan and Afghanistan was about, let me check just a second.
About $60–70 million?
No, actually it was much higher.
Much higher?
Yeah, it was like Uzbekistan has like 1 billion and Tajikistan had like
because
300.
I was under the impression that the maximum power is coming from Hairatan, from Uzbekistan. That is where because there was an Indian company that was involved in setting up the power transmission lines all the way from Hairatan down to Kabul and building a couple of electric substations along the way, step-down substations and so on. And
it reached, at some point it reached like $100 million, but last year, of course, it was a bit low, like $60–70 million.
Yeah. So, and in that, because I think the power trade with Tajikistan is relatively smaller compared to Uzbekistan, although there was potential. The idea was that there would be a hydel project on the Panj River, which would then be able to supply. But I don't think that Panj River project ever took off.
The issue with Tajik power supply, it has seasonal supply. So it cannot provide electricity during the winter or fall period. Uzbekistan has a slightly different energy system. It can generate electricity, the amount of electricity using its gas during the winter period. So it has continued to provide electricity in this period. But Tajikistan mainly during summer and spring period.
Yeah. So let's open up the questions if there are. I don't see any more questions, and at least I can't see any questions. If Vishal or anybody else can see if there are any questions or comments in the chat which people want to raise or.
Chair, can I ask a question?
Yes, of course.
Thanks, Chair. You see, just now I think we have a very vivid discussion of different regional countries' role and perspectives on Afghanistan. But I just would like to raise a question about Indians' perspectives in Afghanistan. You see that after the August 15th, I noticed that Foreign Secretary Jaishankar just mentions that India will take a
Foreign
Minister.
He was foreign secretary many years ago.
That's the foreign minister.
Yes.
Okay, mentions that India will take a so-called wait and watch policy, and also notice that in until last month, the India held the Afghan issue conference of almost all the neighboring countries. I think a lot of the so-called regional security conference on Afghanistan. And just now, our colleagues in Pakistan also mentioned that the Indian assistance already transfer the Pakistan territory to Afghanistan. So that you take all this kind of element into account. So the question is that how in general, how Indian front view the change in Afghanistan, and what's the potential foreign policies, what the potential for policy towards Afghanistan of India in the near term? Thanks.
Well, I can't speak for the government, as you can understand. I mean, I retired many years ago. But from what I have seen of the statements and things like that, I would say that the key difference between, let us say, Iran or China or Russia or Uzbekistan, Pakistan, of course, in a separate category altogether, because as Professor Hoodbhoy also told us, I mean, Pakistan has had a very strong relationship with the Taliban. After all, the Taliban more or less grew up, came of age, gained their adulthood, and so on in Pakistani madrasas. So we put Pakistan's relationship with Taliban in a separate category. But among the other countries, India is the only one which had no contact with the Taliban at all. I mean, the Taliban delegations, China has had dialogue at beginning with Urumqi and all that, and they've been involved in the extended Troika +1, etc., whatever. And, then, of course, in more recent times, in June or July, perhaps, you had the Taliban delegation, which was...
In July, yes.
Yes, which was received by Foreign Minister Wang Yi. Moscow was hosting the Taliban with various Moscow platform, Moscow dialogue, etc., etc. Uzbekistan, they had visited Tashkent and things like that. Tehran, Foreign Minister Zarif had received Taliban delegations. India had not. So in a sense, that is part of it. And after that, after 15th of August, there have been some, we've closed our embassy. I mean, you have your embassy functioning, you have an ambassador there, Russia has an ambassador there, Pakistan, of course, not only has an ambassador, but also has its ISI Director General visiting and advising them on various issues. Iran embassy is there. So we don't. I mean, we closed our embassy on 17th of August. We don't have any diplomatic presence left in Afghanistan. So there was some, a preliminary kind of a contact through when one of these senior Taliban negotiators, Stanikzai, who is deputy minister now, he had met our ambassador in Doha. And we've seen some statements from the Taliban indicating that they would welcome Indian cooperation, economic assistance. However, we have lost a lot of people in Afghanistan, and that is thanks to the Haqqani network. The Indian embassy was targeted on 7th of July 2008, in which about 50 people were killed in a suicide bombing attack. Most of those were innocent Afghan bystanders, but there were also Indian security personnel, as well as the Indian military attaché, Brigadier Mehta, and an Indian senior diplomat counselor called Mr. Venkateshwar. Mr. Venkateshwar Rao. So, and we know that the Haqqani network is in an extremely powerful position, controlling Interior Ministry, intelligence, law and order, as well as all the eastern provinces. So clearly, there are certain security concerns. We don't see merely on the basis of a statement by the Taliban that India is going to go forward and reopen its embassy. But at the same time, we also understand the difficulties that the Afghan people face. And the assistance program that we had, which was a very, very extensive economic cooperation and assistance program during the last 2 decades, was focused on development for the Afghan people. And we have a certain relationship with the Afghan people. And so therefore, we have provided this humanitarian assistance for the Afghan people. We just hope that this will go to all the people without the government being selective about it in Kabul. Because we would not like to see a humanitarian crisis in Afghanistan. But at the same time, we have certain security concerns with respect to some of the outfits operating out of Kabul. And those security concerns remain valid. And that also explains that why, unlike other countries that can perhaps seal their borders more easily or things like that, we feel that we are part of this region, and therefore, whatever happens there, if there is instability there, it creates problems. And that is why we had this conference at the level of the National Security Advisor, which was hosted in November, which unfortunately our Chinese and Pakistani friends stayed away from. So I think that is roughly where I would say where the Indian position is. We will continue to support. We announced 50,000 tons of food aid and medical assistance. In fact, on one of the flights which had come in to bring back some of the Indians who had been stranded in Afghanistan, we sent back 1.6 tons of urgent medical supplies for one of the hospitals in Kabul. So I think that's what the scene is.
Okay. Thank you.
Any questions from anybody? Let me ask you, Professor Wang, you remember I think it was on, if I remember right, it was on 8th of October that there was the suicide attack at the mosque, at the Shia mosque in Kunduz, in which about 50 people were killed. This was a Shia mosque. Attack was then claimed by ISK, Islamic State Khorasan. Later on, there was a release by ISK, which gave the name of the suicide attacker. The suicide bomber was called his name was, or at least the name that he used was Mohammad al-Uiguri. And the statement of the ISK said that this is a message to the Taliban to indicate that they should not get so close to China because China is oppressing the Muslims in Xinjiang and so on. So how does that, was there any reaction from Beijing on that, or in the sense the fact that here was somebody who was obviously a Uyghur who had, frankly, I don't know of any other suicide attacker coming from the Uyghur movement. This was probably the first name that surfaced, which is why it kind of created a certain amount of concern, or, you know, people remembered it, but I'm sure that it must have created some concerns in Beijing as well.
So thanks for the question. Although I did not know the details, the name you mentioned, frankly speaking, I did not notice that such kind of details. But I can give several simple response. First and the foremost is that I think the Xinjiang issues. I think the logic is very simple because given the geopolitics or the great competition, so-called from the Indo-Pacific, US side really think China is a great competitor. So that all this kind of propaganda, either Xinjiang or other like Hong Kong, this kind of propaganda against China. I think China is already, what should I say? See a lot of this kind of propaganda. That is the first comment. But this kind of propaganda originated from the geopolitics or the great competition. The second issue is that about what happened in Afghanistan. We all know that after the August 15th, I think the major problem, internal security problems, is from the conflict between Taliban with the NATO troops to the conflict between Afghan Taliban to Daesh as well as other affiliated organizations. I think the attacks you mentioned Kunduz, but also happened in Kabul and in I think in Nangarhar.
Yes.
Kandahar. It's kind of different provinces and cities. I think the logic is very simple. The reason why is that because ideological competition. Because although they are Afghan Taliban and Daesh, they all claim some kind of same ideology, but really great difference. Because we all know that Afghan Taliban focus on the territory of Afghanistan. You can see from the name, the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, that the emirate itself means that the Taliban focus on the regional issues. I mean the Afghanistan territory. But I think Daesh really have what should I say, a bigger picture of what it will do. Maybe Afghanistan, even the Central Asia and South Asia, just step one. But the ultimate goal for Daesh is the so-called the Haripa all across all over the world. That is second. The reason one. The reason two is that after US withdraw from Afghanistan, really, I think Daesh want to have more power, more voice in Afghanistan. Daesh does not want Afghan Taliban to monopolize the powers or voice in Afghanistan. That is the second comment. The third comment is talk about the so-called ETIMs relationships with the IS or Daesh. I think there are some kind of reports already mentions that maybe in the past several years, as early as 2017, it says that ETM already have some kind of relationship with the Daesh, but also we from some kind of United Nations Security Council report also admits that in some circumstances the ETM fighter fight together with the Daesh. But as you mentioned, I did not meet any of these kind of guys in Afghanistan, so that it just gets this kind of very simple impression that some kind of thing that happens in Afghanistan in the past 2 or 3 years. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Anybody has any questions, please?
If I can ask, I have a short question for Alexey. Russia was very much involved in this peace track, in the peacemaking in Afghanistan. But there were concerns, as you said, about the narcotic trade and things like that. But how worried, because Pervez Hoodbhoy talked about emboldening of these radical constituencies in the entire region, and that includes the Caucasian region as well, which Russia is apprehensive of. So how worried Russia is about the fallout of Taliban's return to Kabul on the political dynamics in the Caucasian region? And another question that I wanted to ask, that how does Russia view about this post-withdrawal regional political dynamics, keeping Afghanistan at its heart?
Okay, so I'll answer the first question. Well, in fact, we do not connect, do not associate Caucasian problems with Afghan problems, because we look Afghanistan, first of all, as not maybe Afghanistan, but Taliban 2.0, well, as Muslim movement that includes into the Afghan border. So we hope that they will not extend the influence into, well, neighboring regions, neighboring countries. But the main thing that, in fact, Afghans has no any ethnic, any cultural ties with Caucasian region people. So we could have some problems with Dagestan, Chechnya, and so on, but they're absolutely different from Afghanistan. They had no ties. And they never had ties even during the Chechen wars in the 90s. Excuse me, could you repeat your second question?
Basically, the emerging political dynamics post-US withdrawal in the entire region.
Well, we think that, in fact, it's something like bargaining. We are trying to guarantee, maybe not guarantee, we are trying to have a deal with Taliban to keep the terrorism in bay. So they will fight with their terroristic attacks inside the Afghanistan. They will keep their most radical groups. They will fight them themselves, and they will fight against ISI. Oh, not ISI, I'm sorry. IS, Islamic State. And so we will help them not with the weapons, because the weapons are enough after American withdrawal, but with maybe some humanitarians, and maybe with will help them to restore their economic capabilities of Afghanistan, especially in rural, among rural population. So, we had a very interesting project there with our local hydro stations. Mini hydro stations, they were focused on improving of agrarian capabilities of local communities. So, in fact, it's our position that improving of level of living standards will improve the stability in the country. And so we are hoping that with our help, we will keep the terrorists at the bay. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Sure.
Yeah.
Alexey, Russia is one of the few countries that continues to have a close relationship with the Taliban and yet maintains the Taliban on its list of terrorist organizations. I mean, don't the Taliban tell the Russians that, look, what is this? I mean, you keep inviting us to Moscow and then you call us a terrorist organization. Isn't there some kind of a dichotomy here?
So In fact, I would not call this relationship close. They are very pragmatic, but it's not the relations of two friends, of maybe two allies. It's relations of two neighbors, in fact. So they are very pragmatic because we will give you maybe some economic aid, we will give you not recognition, but a kind of recognition. We will invite you into our projects, we will invite you into our conference, and you will fight your terrorists yourself. It's not a problem. Well, in fact, you know that in Russia, there are a lot of jokes about the situation that we call them, in fact, officially, any our newspaper, any our TV show have to, after the mention of Taliban, have to add restricted organization is prohibited in Russia. Terroristic organization is prohibited in Russia. So it was some funny things when representatives of terroristic organizations that prohibited in Russia were welcomed in Russia, in Moscow, during the negotiations. So it doesn't cast any shadow on our external policy, in fact, on pragmatic policy. But I think, I'm not sure, well, we are waiting when the situation will be clarified. Maybe not clarified, but solved. So a lot of our journalists, a lot of our politicians are not happy about that, about the setting every time.
Yes, I think one sign of a major power is that a major power can hold contradictory positions simultaneously and make both acceptable to the rest of the world. So,
sir, if you permit me, can I make an intervention, a small, brief intervention?
Yeah, well, we are coming close to the end of the time, but go ahead, very
Yes,
brief, please. 30 seconds.
In 2015 or 16, there was a conference in Grozny. Obviously, Russia was involved in that convening of that conference. And the title of the conference was, "Who is a Sunni Muslim?" And the mullahs from Al-Azhar and various other Islamic international universities and scholarship had come. And they very selectively left out the Wahhabis from the Sunni list of Sunni subsects. And the idea was this, it was, Russia was accused of trying to keep the Salafis out and keep the Deobandi Hanafis and all Hanafis in. So perhaps the perception was, and Saudi Arabia, that's why objected to that conference, because it was seen that Russia is trying to create a wedge between the Hanafi Deobandis of the Taliban and the Salafi Wahhabi movement of Al-Qaeda and others. So that because in the perception of Russia, the Salafi jihadists are a bigger threat, and they wanted to create a wedge between the Hanafi Deobandis of Taliban. And after that, we have seen greater Russian association with the Taliban and through Iran. So this has been a policy. I don't know whether Mr. Alexis would like to shed any light, or we have time on that. Thank you.
I think DG will have to organize a separate conference on
We are happy to do that, but if you wish to take another 5 minutes, we are quite glad to do that.
No, but I mean,
there could be another youngster or so. I was wondering if we can bring in one more youngster. We want them to, be part of something, to ask a question. So can we bring Aisha in, please, if she has a question or something?
No, but I have been asking people for questions for the last half an hour, but
yeah, I'm working behind the scenes. I'm actually assisting you without your knowledge.
All right.
So, in the meanwhile, can I ask a small question to Umarov?
Go ahead.
Dr. Umarov, you talked about Uzbekistan's position as well, but I would like to know from you, what kind of relationship is there between the Uzbeks of Afghanistan and Uzbekistan? And where is it, in the wake of return of Taliban? Because many of the guys fled to Uzbekistan, and some of them perhaps are still there. So what is your view on that?
Thank you for your question. So Uzbekistan official position on Uzbeks in Afghanistan, not just in Afghanistan, but any Uzbek communities living around Uzbekistan in a variety of countries was that they are still citizens of those countries. They're Uzbeks by ethnicity, but they're citizens of those countries. So based on this position, they always perceived these people, so they supported them was necessary, like for teaching or education, if there was any need for support, and they gave some support on this issue, but at least they tried to separate this ethnicity issues and the relations with other countries. So, but during and with recent changes, there was a lot of discussion in Uzbekistan among the society that now Uzbeks in Afghanistan are not treated well. So this was part of the meeting between Uzbek foreign minister, who visited Kabul, and there kind of Taliban committed to provide necessary rights and freedoms to Uzbeks. And immediately after that visit, there was a bit, again, fun story. There was a kind of festival of Uzbek language and literature in Mazar-e-Sharif. So there was a festival celebrating Uzbek language. Taliban representative participated, though it was quite symbolic thing which happened. But again, there is no kind of emphasis on just Uzbeks. Uzbekistan is trying to have broader links in Afghanistan, not just limit itself with Uzbek community, but definitely due to this historical connections and ethnic connections and other issues, we are definitely ready to support Uzbek community in Afghanistan and to provide necessary things like education. And that the educational center was established in Uzbekistan like 3 years ago in Pervez, and initially it just prepared some Afghan students who planned to work in Uzbek schools in Afghanistan. But then it broadened its activities, and before this takeover happened, it was involved in teaching like engineers, medical suppliers, doctors, nurses. They had a variety of programs for Afghan citizens, mainly from north of Afghanistan, for further supporting this capacity building in this country.
Thank you.
So, Chair, would you permit one more question from one of our younger scholars? This is also time for us to mentor them in some ways, get them to, participate. So we have brought Saman Aisha onto the list of panels. If you permit, she will ask a question through you.
Well, I can read out the question to Alexey. Alexey, the question to you is, how far do you think Russia can hold its pragmatic position regarding Taliban? What could be the trigger that pushes Russia off the edge? I mean, you can try and be an astrologer a little bit, Alexey, perhaps, in answering that question.
You can at least start her camera, please, the video for Aisha.
No, Aisha has to switch it on.
Yeah, Aisha, please switch on your camera because you're the one who has asked the question, though the chair has read it out already.
Yeah. Alexey?
Okay, so I think we have one very clear trigger. First of all, it's invasion from the Afghanistan territory. It's the beginning of terroristic war in Central Asia and beginning of increasing of drug trafficking. First of all, we will try to strengthen the southern border along the northern Afghanistan border, and then, well, after any attack from Afghanistan territory, I think we'll use the first.
Yep.
So it's quite easy.
Yeah. All right. I didn't need much predictive powers here. So that is it. I think we have, even though we lost two of our panelists, we still managed to cover 2.5 hours. So which is thanks to some excellent interventions and great conversations with all of you. So I just want to thank the IDSA as well as my old friend Sujan Chinoy for inviting me here, and also all the panelists who have been most kind and gracious. So with that, I wish you all the very best and look forward to engaging with you once again on a future date on the future of Afghanistan. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all.
Sindhu, you would like to make an announcement?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. I'm
Thank
sure I'll be echoing the sentiments of all participants when I say that this was a truly interesting and insightful session. On
Thank you.
behalf of TG MP-IDSA, I extend our many thanks to the chair and all the speakers for your erudite presentations and discussions. Thank you all too for your patience with some of the unexpected glitches that we faced. This
No
session
problem.
ends here.